Justice, but it has nothing to do with meddling or influencing the 2016 election. Maybe it has to do with taxes or something that's, maybe not as interesting. Maybe that's part of the reason why he decided not to come to a conclusion, because it wasn't pertinent to the underlying crime, as they say.
Well, it's also really interesting to remember that there were other investigations that were kicked off to the Southern District of New York and outside of this related investigation. So there are still conclusions to be made from those investigations. We are hearing again from Finn Gomez, our White House producer, who says that the White House did not know of the contents of what Mueller is going to say. It is significant that Mueller did give them a heads up, which speaks to what we were talking about earlier, which is that he doesn't want this to be a political scene. But it's also interesting, too, to consider how the public has been internalizing this, absorbing this, what they want from Mueller. CBS News polling found that 74% of Americans thought that Mueller should testify in front of Congress, and that included Republicans. But they're still very split on what to take away from this report. 31% saying that the report had cleared the president of illegal activity, 33% feeling it had not, and another third feeling it was too soon to tell. So the public is still trying to, sort through this, and that is why members of Congress, particularly Democrats, wanted Mueller to appear in front of the public to talk about this taxpayer-funded investigation and provide some more clarity for that. And that is supported by a majority, it looks like, of Americans.
Mm-hmm. So at 11 a.m., Robert Mueller, we're just coming on to the half-hour mark here, just a little over a half hour to go, where Robert Mueller will make his public statement on the investigation. 22 months, 448 pages, Ed. Not taking any questions, which is, I think, going to, if you're, Ed, all of us, we're reporters, I think we have a couple of questions for Mr. Mueller.
Yeah, it's sort of darned if you do, darned if you don't, I think, for him at this point. Because you're right, you could take hours of questions from reporters, or none at all, and it reserves the possibility that he is going to at some point speak to lawmakers at least about what went on. The negotiations there have been going back and forth about whether it's in public, whether he does it behind closed doors to sort of preserve the dignity of the exchange, and then perhaps allow a transcript of it to be released later. We'll see. That has yet to be concluded. Congress, remember, is out of town this week on the Memorial Day recess, so reaction from lawmakers could be a little time coming, or at least a little more scattershot, because they are scattered not only here in the United States but around the world on various overseas trips. And as we said earlier, the Attorney General is in Alaska for previously scheduled travel. He has our Jan Crawford along for the ride, and she will be interviewing him tomorrow for an interview we'll see Friday. The White House, we're told, was informed that the special counsel might want to make a statement today. Last night, our colleagues at the White House can't clarify for certain. They do not know the contents of what he will say, but they were given a heads up last night, just checking here, that he would potentially speak. So that's essentially all we know at this point. And we wait with bated breath for a guy who has dominated the discourse and the thinking of so much of what's gone on in this city and really in politics across the country for the past 2 years. Why he would suddenly pick today, the 29th of May at 11 a.m. Eastern on a Wednesday, to speak out is a big mystery for at least another 34 minutes or so.
It will be interesting, Caitlin, because as Ed points out, members of Congress are still out for the holiday. What kind of reaction we get from them?
What we get from them and what they're hearing from their constituents.
Because you pointed out those poll numbers.
Exactly, pointing out those poll numbers. And also remember that we're talking about Nancy Pelosi's difficult task, kind of balancing various members of her caucus. And many of them who helped secure the majority for Democrats come from districts that were traditionally Republican and Republican in their DNA, districts that voted for Trump, a lot of them. And we've been kind of watching to see how lawmakers in those districts, Democrats, respond to these calls for impeachment, how they respond to this investigation. So it'll be interesting to see if they're getting any feedback back home after they hear from Mueller, whether that provides any clarity for not only lawmakers, but for voters listening in as well.
So it's sort of all up in the air, right? I mean, the big sort of issue is, I think the big questions that everyone wants answered is, what was the intention when Robert Mueller wrote out a list of examples of possible obstruction of justice but didn't come to a conclusion? Did he want Congress to make the final call? Did he want the Justice Department to make the final call? Did he expect nothing would happen because, hey, a sitting president is not going to be indicted? Did he think that the two portions of the report were really not connected, because he felt there might have been obstruction, but not as it related to Russian meddling? And so they were sort of two different things and didn't rise to the level of needing congressional involvement.
Yeah, I just want to point out to our viewers, when we take different camera shots, what they're seeing there is in our control room, from time to time, shots will pop up and our director will take them. That is a live shot right now to the Department of Justice podium, where we expect that Robert Mueller will be making an announcement. The pool camera sometimes moves the camera or sets it up in a different way, or sometimes it even goes to bars, and so that's why you may see those bars appear on your screen, or a shot moves out of the way, like this one, which is the outside, where I guess we're expecting maybe they're taking this shot because we're expecting that's where we'll catch a glimpse of Robert Mueller. And of course, you got to have those cameras there to catch him walking into a building. But that is what we're expecting there. We need something to talk over, right? So that's what you're seeing when we're showing.
It is sort of interesting that we have no idea what his voice sounds like, and it occurred to me that maybe he doesn't sound anything like Robert De Niro. But he's got a high-pitched voice.
I think that's such an important point that Ed made. That even though he was FBI director for a dozen years, he had testified in front of Congress, that most Americans don't remember that or haven't recalled that, and how elusive he's been. Remember all these reports that we've seen? Mueller was spotted here, out here. He goes to a church across the street from the White House with his wife, was asked by a reporter after the Mueller report came out, or after the conclusions from Barr came out, I should say, and he wouldn't comment. So he has been elusive. Everyone in Washington has been kind of keeping an eye out for him. He was spotted once at an Apple store getting his MacBook fixed, and that inspired a whole roll of memes and questions about what is on that computer. Right. So it really just speaks to how much Mueller has played a role in national politics, yet has stayed out of the political fray, really. So this is such a significant moment, just hearing from him today.
And yet, Ed, the president always likes to say that the special counsel and the investigation was led by 18 angry Democrats. We hear that over and over and over again. One thing we are sure of, I think, is that Robert Mueller's a Republican. Am I right about that?
That's right, he is. And, as elusive as he's been, maybe it's been a model for how other people involved in these kinds of things could comport themselves. Stay out of the limelight, just keep your head down and do your job. He comes from a different era of public service. Vietnam veteran, somebody who was a career federal prosecutor. I remember an interview a few months ago with Bill Weld, the Republican presidential candidate, who actually had hired Mueller to work at the DOJ offices in Boston as a senior attorney there. And he said, he's one of the most upstanding guys you'll ever meet, principled, literally buttoned up, always well kept, very serious about his work. And so to see him today, for whatever reason, feel compelled to come and speak out, it's a marker, because this is someone, again, we have not heard from, and who has been very reluctant through a spokesperson to comment much at all on any of the reports that have surfaced over the last 2 years, some of which have panned out, some of which have not. And it seems, for whatever reason, today he wants to speak out. I think we should remind people again, Caitlin did a little of this, we have reams of recent CBS News polling to sort of help set the table here as we hit this crossroads of sort of where Americans sit on all of this. Because there's the ongoing question of what exactly should happen next now that the report is out, and how should the president cooperate or not cooperate. And while 53% of Americans would like to see congressional Democrats move on from this, and only 44% say they should continue to investigate. When it comes to whether or not the Trump administration should cooperate with congressional investigations, 77% of Americans say yes, it should. 20% say it shouldn't. So it's kind of, you got it both ways there. America would like to see them move on, but if Democrats don't move on, the president should play ball with them and cooperate. And so neither thing is happening right now, right? Democrats haven't shelved this entirely, and the administration isn't cooperating. So it's running counter to what Americans want. Let's see if what gets said today and the reaction to it does anything in the next few days to change the calculus at all.
But also the dilemma for Democrats is that quite often Democrats, when they're polled, want them to continue pushing. And I think, so what should congressional Democrats do now? Among Democrats,
73%.
Exactly.
You're looking at the same sheet. You're looking at the same cheat as I am. Yeah.
But here's the thing. I find this one intriguing. The feelings about the Mueller report, given that we're all waiting with bated breath at 11 a.m. for the special counsel to make this announcement. 58% of Americans have heard enough of Robert Mueller. Only 37% want to hear more. That's across all Americans.
And yet, 74% say he should testify to Congress, and 19% say he shouldn't.
You know, maybe there's a combination here. Obviously, there was a certain amount of dissatisfaction once the Mueller report came out, right?
From Democrats.
Yeah, from Democrats, and perhaps even people beyond Democrats. Maybe not, true sort of tried and true Trump supporters, but maybe there's dissatisfaction with them too, that we're even still having this conversation. And so, for all that 2 years of investigating, there's still unanswered questions, and there's still the business of this country to run. We still need health care. We still can't hammer out an infrastructure deal. We have a problem at the border. I mean, maybe what the American people are saying, at least in this poll, is can you please walk and chew gum at the same time?
Absolutely, and I think that's what Ed and I have been hearing from voters on the ground too, is that the Mueller report rarely comes up. Questions asked from voters at various town halls of the 2020 candidates. Instead, it's things like healthcare, climate change, issues around gun control or gun restrictions, and other items that are a little more personal about themselves, about the economy, how their personal economy. They're not really engaged in the Mueller report. That doesn't mean that they don't want Congress to do its job. That doesn't mean that they don't want these investigations to continue. I'm talking about the Democratic Party base or those who show up to these events, but this has not been top of mind for voters, at least what we've seen on the campaign trail, the way that it has kind of been overarching here. But I think the idea that the public has such mixed feelings about kind of how to go, what to internalize from this, the president has really seized on that. Remember, over the course of the past 2 years, he's been denigrating this investigation, and we started to see in polling some movement, certainly among Republicans, but also among independents wanting this to reach its conclusion. And he also, after, that's why it was so significant that Barr came out with that 4-page memo, because it allowed the president to really capture the narrative that he wanted to and move forward with it before anybody else could really see the underlying report.
Yeah.
So we should point out that we're in a working newsroom, and the noise that you hear is from CBS This Morning. They're about to go into their morning meeting, and so they generally gather at around 10:30. And you'll hear them again at 11 a.m. Just as this is happening, because they come out of that meeting at 11 a.m.
Maybe coming out a little bit earlier, so they're ready for
loud,
this.
So just warning our viewers. Ed, one of the things that we were talking about earlier with Caitlin is around this impeachment inquiry that Nancy Pelosi is struggling with, whether or not to even begin an impeachment inquiry. There are some who say, let's get to impeaching, and there are others who are urging caution. You've heard people say, look, Bill Clinton, after his impeachment, came out with poll numbers higher than ever. And others have said, but no, once the information came out about Richard Nixon when he was being investigated for Watergate, his numbers went down. And so people are trying to figure out what the calculus is. And I throw out the suggestion that because this Trump administration is so different from administrations past, we don't really know what the calculus is going to look like on either side.
We're anticipating that this week, with town hall meetings and other public events back home, with the chance to literally run into constituents at the store or at the airport, that a lot of these lawmakers would potentially get a better sense of how Congress should proceed.
Interesting.
Undoubtedly, as Justin Amash in Michigan last night, the Republican got, others are holding events and will be hearing from voters. And you look at reports of how these kinds of events have gone in recent weeks. And, there's mostly questions, as Caitlin said, whether it's on the campaign trail or at these congressional events, about policy. But inevitably, somebody brings it up. And it's up to the lawmaker there to decide what exactly to do or say. There is a real divide among Democrats about how to proceed. Impeachment inquiry, meaning compiling the information and making a decision later, is far different than a formal impeachment process. And there are many now in the House Democratic caucus who are kind of resigned to the fact that it's likely by the fall that some kind of impeachment inquiry at least will be formally underway, that the pressure will just continue to snowball, at least from these Democratic dominant districts, and compel Democrats to continue proceeding with these investigations in a more formal fashion. Whether they ultimately go all the way remains to be seen. And there were some that said that the way that the president and the speaker, Nancy Pelosi, comported themselves last week by discussing this issue and lobbing insults at each other was also an acknowledgement from two principal characters that inevitably Washington may be headed in that direction, that the president will have to face a House of Representatives that is looking into him in a more formal way while also trying to legislate with him. There are some critical deadlines and some financial issues that have to be sorted out, the debt limit, a budget that would keep the government open past the end of September. Being able to do those sensitive things while also dealing potentially with these kinds of investigations makes things tricky, both from a functional congressional standpoint and from a partisan political standpoint, because you also, of course, have presidential candidates out there clamoring for this, although many of them now smartly reminding their voters in a pretty pragmatic way that while we may support impeachment, remember there's a Republican-controlled Senate that is unlikely to even take up the issue. And so do you really want to go halfway with the Democratic-controlled side of Congress doing this, knowing that you're ultimately going to hit a Republican wall that doesn't want to take up the issue?
I think, part of the issue when you sort of compare what happened with Bill Clinton and sort of looking at the situation is what happened with Bill Clinton started out as an investigation into like a real estate thing. And then by the time, the general public was interested in it, it was suddenly Monica Lewinsky and a whole other thing. And the Republicans started to sort of come off like they were blindly focused on getting him no matter what. And then when I look at the Mueller report and I look at the conclusion that yes, there was Russian meddling, but in regards to obstruction of justice, it's not connected. It's not like it's not like Mueller was able to prove that the Trump campaign was deliberately trying to shield the investigators from uncovering a connection, right? So then it starts to look like, well, now you're going after him for something else that he was covering up. And maybe he doesn't want you to see his taxes. I don't want you to see my taxes.
Well, it was interesting, too, because we did kind of hear from Trump in the Mueller report. Remember, he had kind of looked at what happened to Clinton and looked at what happened with that special counsel investigation and was concerned that this investigation could go really anywhere, even beyond what the mandate originally suggested, because that is what happened with Clinton. And that weighed heavily on the president's mind, as we know from reading the Mueller report, that he was thinking about that. And that's why we did see him time and time again denigrate the investigation, call it illegal, even though it wasn't. It was completely legal and conducted by his own Justice Department or sanctioned by his own Justice Department. But still, the president was kind of studying that history here. And they're studying it again, the response to Clinton's actual impeachment by the House of Representatives and how that was received by the public, the backlash that inspired at the ballot box, and they are kind of looking at the political fallout of that as well. But just to point out, from our own Mark Knoller, who of course captures everything and remembers everything for us here at CBS News, just in Tokyo, Trump was talking about this, calling the Mueller report no obstruction, no collusion, no nothing. It's a beautiful report. So we'll see if that holds after we actually hear from Mueller himself.
The historical antecedents are always interesting to me because I love history, and we talked about that, Ed, earlier with Caitlin about people trying to compare President Clinton's popularity after his impeachment to what could potentially happen if the Democrats choose to impeach President Trump. But there are so many different factors that are involved. First of all, President Clinton continued to work with a Republican Congress even as he was being impeached. He had a very strong economy, which certainly gave him win in his sales, but he was also negotiating the Kosovo mass killings that were happening in Yugoslavia. There were a lot of things that he was working with his quote-unquote enemies like Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay on the other side of the aisle. He did not say, as this president has said, you can't have investigations with investments or infrastructure.
No legislation.
Right, while you're investigating
Right.
him. He doesn't want to do that. The other thing, when we talk about Watergate, the economy then was tanking. In the early 1970s, President Nixon did not have the wind in his back with the economy. And as more information came out, as the Watergate hearings played out on national television, people became aware at the levels at which that president was corrupt. That's what turned public opinion on Richard Nixon. And so it's hard to draw those conclusions given some of those historical antecedents, but I think that's what they're trying to figure out in the Congress. That's, I think, what Nancy Pelosi, given her long history in the Congress and her deep understanding of congressional history, is trying to wrestle with.
Right, and it's going to be tricky for them here in the next few hours maybe to get a sense of how exactly to respond. You're looking there, by the way, at the press room at the Department of Justice where the special counsel is going to speak in under 20 minutes. We know, for example, that Speaker Pelosi is in San Francisco today. She spoke at a commencement address there in her hometown last night. Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, was back home in New York dealing with local matters. So undoubtedly there will be some back and forth today, some conference calls among members of the caucus to figure out how exactly to respond and proceed. We know also that the president is aware that the special counsel is going to speak out. Guidance from the White House given to reporters is it's unclear whether or not he will comment and in what fashion after the fact when Mueller speaks at 11 a.m. And so we'll have to wait there and see exactly how he responds. Sorry, just taking a look at a few different things as they come in here.
Yeah, there's a lot of information coming to us from our reporters and our crews at various locations in D.C., Ed, as you know, so that's okay.
Yeah, that's what, and that's I'm kind of perusing that as we go here. Either way, the White House is aware. Members of Congress now obviously poised to see what he has to say and respond. For those just joining in, we anticipate that Mueller will speak for at least 8 minutes. The guidance is that he will not take questions from people in the room. It is unclear what exactly he plans to talk about, but whatever it is, his office gave a heads up to the White House last night that he might speak out today. His boss, the Attorney General, Bill Barr, is in Alaska on previously scheduled travel there for some official duties. He is joined by our Jan Crawford, our legal correspondent, who actually is already scheduled to interview him for an interview we'll start seeing on Friday, if not perhaps tomorrow. And again, this caught everyone, I guess, outside the White House and Mueller's staff off guard this morning. We were not anticipating this, but the announcement came about an hour and a half ago that something would be coming together here at the Justice Department. And as you can see, many of our colleagues have assembled pretty quickly, as they've been tasked to do several times over the past 2 years with this investigation. And so we'll see. This is the first time we've heard Mueller speak publicly since he took the job in the spring of 2017. He has outstanding invitations to testify before Congress, and the details of that are still being sorted out if it ever happens. And of course, he remains the subject of fascination and speculation here in town and across the country. So we await eagerly to see what exactly he has to say.
Yeah, and going back to what a point that you made earlier, because as you said, most people don't remember what Robert Mueller's voice sounds like. But the characterization that the Attorney General had of that 448-page report, Mr. Mueller did object to the portrayal of the special counsel's findings by the Attorney General. And in particular, he pointed out that Mr. Barr's characterization that the report cleared the president from obstruction charges. I just want to read the quote of what Mr. Mueller said. If we had any confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment. That was a response to the Attorney General's 4-page summary.
Well, that was in the report. That was something that the Attorney General sort of took a portion of it for his 4-page summary. But I believe what you read was actually part of the report. Ed, was that part of the report?
That's Robert Mueller's coming out.
That's the memo? Okay.
Right.
Yes, we're kind of splitting hairs there, but there was a portion of it that was quoted in the summary that some said later was taken out of context by Barr, yes. But ultimately, what that report concludes is that they couldn't conclusively determine whether or not to pursue obstruction of justice charges, essentially kicking it to the Attorney General and kicking it to Congress and saying, you have means of dealing with this, go ahead if you'd like to. And they're still grappling with that, obviously, today.
This is just fascinating. I think it's just so interesting that this came out of sort of nowhere. This came out of the blue. I mean, we're sort of trying, and our audiences, we're just like the audience in instances like this when we're trying to use all the knowledge that we have, all of our sources, but ultimately we don't really know what the special counsel is going to say. And so you start to, pick up these different threads and you say, well, Michael Wolff is coming out with a book. Well, there's this 4-page summary. Well, here's what Nancy Pelosi has said. Here's what Justin Amash is saying. He received the standing ovation. You're trying to synthesize all this information in anticipation of this really big moment.
What Ed O'Keefe pointed out, which is no one's in Washington, including his boss.
That's a good point. Good point.
This is, I can't think that he just really likes Wednesdays for announcements. I think this was deliberate, and perhaps it's because of what, Caitlin pointed out, which is that he has been trying to avoid being part of this political spectacle, and he knows that if all the lawmakers are there, immediately everyone's going to sort of file into the hallway, and
Good point.
and it will start.
And our speculating and our wondering what he's going to say has been characteristic of the entire 2 years of this investigation since he was appointed 2 years ago this month, which is pretty amazing to think about how much has transpired in those intervening years. But we haven't heard from him publicly. We've rarely heard from his office. No comment has been the refrain, really, coming from his spokesman. And so this is a significant moment in history where we are going to hear from him, and then we have no idea really what he's going to say. We can, though, kind of glean some information about what we know about him so far, that he hasn't engaged in the political circus of Washington, the traditional kind of the politics that everybody else is engaged in. We know that he's been very cautious about what he does say in public, and we know that many people within the Justice Department, within the FBI, have watched how James Comey was received when he came out. I see Democrats watching this with a little bit of PTSD, as one Democratic strategist put on Twitter, because they have seen the way that this can go. Mueller has taken pains not to do that, and so that's what's significant about the very notion that we're going to hear from him.
And can you just imagine, guys, we pointed out, Ed, that the White House did receive notification that Robert Mueller was going to be making this, but I'm not thinking that he's notified members of Congress. Maybe he has, but it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I would just love to be that fly on the wall. You're out there fly fishing or doing whatever you're doing on your holiday, and all of a sudden your tweet starts popping up. Robert Mueller's going to make an announcement, and you're a member of Congress. It doesn't matter what party you are, and you start to go, wait, what?
Well, recesses are working recesses.
Yeah, they are. They're with their constituents. Hey, Ed, maybe
in defense of them, Vlad.
Okay, good. Defense of Congress. I like that.
I don't know if either of you would sort of know the answer to this, but so we have the report. Is there a particular reason why Robert Mueller has not been, I presume, I'm pretty sure, has not been dismissed by the Justice Department? I mean, he's done now, right? Why is he still sort of working under the Justice Department?
There's still some loose ends that have to be tied up. And there are, remember that there were several portions of that report that were redacted. That has to do with active investigations that either his office or that is semi-related to it. And so I think that's part of it, is that he has to hold on to allow for that to sort of play out. And so,
so he remains.
There's also, frankly, if you're someone who sides with the president and all this, you've got a selfish interest to keep him on the DOJ payroll as long as you can, because you can control exactly how he speaks to Congress, if ever. That's not the primary reason why he's being held on the payroll, but certainly for some, at least close to the president, that would be a consideration and seen as a good thing that he's still there. So we'll see. One thing will be interesting to learn is whether Mueller gave a heads up to Bill Barr that he was going to do this. We don't know that yet.
Yeah.
Because remember, a few years ago, an FBI director came out and said some things that the rest of the Justice Department didn't know about.
We remember.
And here we are. So we'll see exactly, and we'll probably learn throughout the rest of the day exactly the thought process here and why this played out exactly the way it did. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's where we are. We're 10 minutes away from this moment, and it is, if we take a step back, a remarkable moment after almost 2 years of an investigation, a 448-page report. The American people are finally going to hear directly from the special counsel Robert Mueller, something that has not happened yet, at least not under these circumstances and within the time frame of his investigation. And so it is intriguing, and something that we talked about earlier, that he is going directly to the American people. He's been there. We know that there are lawmakers that would love to see him in hearing room, but he's chosen this particular moment, and we don't know why, but to deliver this message. And I think, we're just a few minutes away, and it's going to be, we're going to spend, Ed, I'm sure, the other side of the statement, a lot of hours dissecting what he said, and that will be remarkable in and of itself. But this is because he's perhaps attempted at some level to stay within the norms of who he is as an elected, as a civil servant. That's not worked out because there's been so much speculation about what he means and what he meant to do, and was he going to do this and was he going to do that?
Yeah.
And so perhaps this is something that he's decided he has to do.
And you got to wonder, no matter what he says, right, depending on where you stand on the issue of, whether the president obstructed justice or not, you're just going to kind of see, what's been happening is people see what they want to see and they hear what they want to hear, because inevitably, he's not going to be able to say everything that he needs to say in 8 minutes. No matter what we've seen, and we've seen a lot of the report, there are some redacted portions of it. So people are always going to interpret, including the president, interpret it to the way that they want to.
Yeah.
To back their argument.
That is true. And it will just be interesting to see, once we know what he has to say, how that is interpreted. And as Ed points out, the last time somebody of that stature, James Comey, came out with a statement that shocked and wowed everybody, we know the results.
Yeah, and everyone was mad at him. And it seems like that is the guarantee, is that people on all sides will be very upset with what you did or did not say.
Yeah. So we are just now about 7 minutes or so away from when we expect to hear from Robert Mueller, the special counsel, the man who's been at the front and center of the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. He will take to that podium there at the Department of Justice. You can see reporters have already gathered. They have been gathering over the last hour or so. Speculation has been rampant on all the news networks because we just don't know exactly what he is going to say. But we are continuing to analyze the story that led us to this point, how we ended up here, how we ended up with Robert Mueller on this day agreeing or making the decision to release a statement that we are told from our reporters and correspondents in Washington will be about 8 minutes long, give or take. We know that the White House was informed that Robert Mueller was going to make this statement last night. So one can assume, if you are a student of politics and of the White House and past White House administrations, that they will have their own statement ready to go once the special counsel is finished speaking. And so we will break down the responses from the White House. We'll break down what Robert Mueller has to say. We have a team of correspondents joining us right now and analysts.
I have a prediction on what the reactions are going to be
like.
Okay. These are general. The Democrats are going to say that's fine and dandy, but we've been asking you to testify in front of Congress. Why don't you, if you want to speak, why don't you come on over? And the Republicans are going to say, why did you say anything at all? The report was the final word on this topic. You didn't need to sort of open up the conversation again. That's what I think the general themes are going to be. That's why I say no one's going to be happy.
No one's going to be happy. That could very well be the case. So Ed O'Keefe is still joining us as we are now just about 5 minutes away from the special counsel speaking. We are going to be joined in just a few minutes by our team of political and legal analysts who are going to be able to sort of give us some of the legalities, some of the questions that we've been mulling over the course of the last hour and a half or so. So Ed is in Washington. He's standing by. Caitlin Huey Burns is still on the set with us. We're also joined by CBS News legal contributor and former U.S. Attorney for the New York County District Office, Rebecca Roiphe. She's joining us now. And Keir Dougal is also on the set with us. He's a former prosecutor for the Eastern District of New York. As we await, we're just about 4 minutes away. Guessing he's a former Marine. He's probably going to be on time, Ed. We don't know, though. So we're going to keep chatting until we see him take to that podium.
Yeah, and as you can see there, we've been watching this feed for the last little bit. It is filled up here with folks who cover the Justice Department for a living, and that should be a signal as well that we're getting close. Again, we have not heard from Mueller in this fashion outside of his writings since he took the job 2 years ago this month. As a former FBI director, this somebody obviously who's accustomed to making these kinds of statements, but this one is arguably the most anticipated of his career, at least so far, if only because he has been such an elusive character in the midst of all this for the past 2 years. We are, I'm just reading something here that reminds us that, again, as we've reported, the White House is aware that, or was aware as of last night, that Mueller might make a statement today. It is unclear whether it was aware of the contents of what Mueller plans to say today. The president is monitoring this from the White House. One of our eagle-eyed colleagues over at the White House points out that there's no Marines standing outside the front door of the West Wing right now, which would mean he's not in the Oval Office, that he is perhaps still up in the residence, as he often is until about 11 a.m. Eastern most weekdays when he's here in Washington. We will see whether or not he has anything to say about this. We've checked. Congressional leaders are scattered across the country. This is a recess week for the House and the Senate after the Memorial Day holiday. Nancy Pelosi's in San Francisco. Chuck Schumer's in New York. Mitch McConnell's in Kentucky. The Judiciary Committee chairman in the House, Jerry Nadler, is in New York. And so reaction from Congress will probably come by way of public statements, maybe some television appearances later in the day. But it's unclear as of right now when or how we'll hear from them, because they don't know either what exactly he's going to say. So Mueller leaving us in suspense for a few more minutes. Here's somebody at the podium. Let's see what they're saying.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller will be coming to give a statement. He is not taking questions. This is just a statement. And he'll be out in about 2 minutes. Thank you.
All right, so 2 minutes to go. Yeah, and Ed, it's good that you point out what the members of Congress are doing. Let me just, for our viewers, we are expecting that there will be a CBS News special report in the next couple of minutes or so. We at CBSN will take that special report, which will be anchored by our Margaret Brennan, host and moderator of Face the Nation. Once that special report is over, we will come back and we will continue the discussion and the analysis of what the special counsel has to say. So a lot of moving parts as we prepare for Robert Mueller to take to that podium. We are joined by our legal contributors. We have about 60 seconds to go until the special report. Keir, real quick thoughts?
I'm going to be interested to see what he has to say about, of course, about obstruction and about how it was handled and rolled out, how the report was rolled out. If he addresses those questions, I think we may learn a lot.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's interesting, the timing. So what prompted it at this particular moment? So I think once we hear what he says, we'll know why he's coming out now with his statement when people have been so ready to hear from him for so long.
Do you think that there will be more, as Anne-Marie and I have been talking about, there may be more questions than answers?
I think that's possible. I mean, we really won't know until we hear from him, I guess, yeah. All
right. We have 10 seconds to go until the special counsel Robert Mueller takes to that podium. Again, if you're just joining us, Robert Mueller is set to make a statement on the Russia investigation 2 years, 448 pages later. This will be the first that we've heard from him.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Margaret Brennan in New York. Special counsel Robert Mueller is about to make his first statement since his report on the Russia investigation was released to the public. He will speak shortly at the Justice Department. The nearly 2-year investigation ended in April and concluded there was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Let's listen now.
2 years ago, the acting attorney general asked me to serve as special counsel, and he created the special counsel's office. The appointment order directed the office to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. This included investigating any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. Now, I have not spoken publicly during our investigation. I'm speaking out today because our investigation is complete. The Attorney General has made the report on our investigation largely public. We are formally closing the special counsel's office, and as well, I'm resigning from the Department of Justice to return to private life. I'll make a few remarks about the results of our work. But beyond these few remarks, it is important that the office's written work speak for itself. Let me begin where the appointment order begins, and that is interference in the 2016 presidential election. As alleged by the grand jury in an indictment, Russian intelligence officers who were part of the Russian military launched a concerted attack on our political system. The indictment alleges that they used sophisticated cyber techniques to hack into computers and networks used by the Clinton campaign. They stole private information and then released that information through fake online identities and through the organization WikiLeaks. The releases were designed and timed to interfere with our election and to damage a presidential candidate. And at the same time, as the grand jury alleged in a separate indictment, a private Russian entity engaged in a social media operation where Russian citizens posed as Americans in order to influence an election. These indictments contain allegations, and we are not commenting on the guilt or the innocence of any specific defendant. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. The indictments allege, and the other activities in our report describe, efforts to interfere in our political system. They needed to be investigated and understood, and that is among the reasons why the Department of Justice established our office. That is also a reason we investigated efforts to obstruct the investigation. The matters we investigated were of paramount importance. It was critical for us to obtain full and accurate information from every person we questioned. When a subject of an investigation obstructs that investigation or lies to investigators, it strikes at the core of the government's effort to find the truth and hold wrongdoers accountable. Let me say a word about the report. The report has two parts, addressing the two main issues we were asked to investigate. The first volume of the report details numerous efforts emanating from Russia to influence the election. This volume includes a discussion of the Trump campaign's response to this activity, as well as our conclusion that there was insufficient evidence to charge a broader conspiracy. And in the second volume, the report describes the results and analysis of our obstruction of justice investigation involving the president. The order appointing me special counsel authorized us to investigate actions that could obstruct the investigation. And we conducted that investigation, and we kept the office of the acting attorney general apprised of the progress of our work. And as set forth in the report, after that investigation, if we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. The introduction to the volume 2 of our report explains that decision. It explains that under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. That is unconstitutional. Even if the charge is kept under seal and hidden from public view, that too is prohibited. The special counsel's office is part of the Department of Justice, and by regulation, it was bound by that department policy. Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider. The department's written opinion explaining the policy makes several important points that further informed our handling of the obstruction investigation. Those points are summarized in our report, and I will describe two of them for you. First, the opinion explicitly permits the investigation of a sitting president because it is important to preserve evidence while memories are fresh and documents available. Among other things, that evidence could be used if there were co-conspirators who could be charged now. And second, the opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing. And beyond department policy, we were guided by principles of fairness. It would be unfair to potentially accuse somebody of a crime when there can be no court resolution of the actual charge. So that was Justice Department policy. Those were the principles under which we operated, and from them we concluded that we would not reach a determination one way or the other about whether the president committed a crime. That is the office's final position, and we will not comment on any other conclusions or hypotheticals about the president. We conducted an independent criminal investigation and reported the results to the Attorney General, as required by department regulations. The Attorney General then concluded that it was appropriate to provide our report to Congress and to the American people. At one point in time, I requested that certain portions of the report be released. The Attorney General preferred to make the entire report public all at once, and we appreciate that the Attorney General made the report largely public, and I certainly do not question the Attorney General's good faith in that decision. Now, I hope and expect this to be the only time that I will speak to you in this manner. I am making that decision myself. No one has told me whether I can or should testify or speak further about this matter. There has been discussion about an appearance before Congress. Any testimony from this office would not go beyond our report. It contains our findings and analysis and the reasons for the decisions we made. We chose those words carefully, and the work speaks for itself. And the report is my testimony. I would not provide information beyond that which is already public in any appearance before Congress. In addition, access to our underlying work product is being decided in a process that does not involve our office. So beyond what I've said here today and what is contained in our written work, I do not believe it is appropriate for me to speak further about the investigation or to comment on the actions of the Justice Department or Congress. And it's for that reason I will not be taking questions today as well. Now, before I step away, I want to thank the attorneys, the FBI agents, the analysts, the professional staff who helped us conduct this investigation in a fair and independent manner. These individuals, who spent nearly 2 years with the special counsel's office, were of the highest integrity. And I will close by reiterating the central allegation of our indictments, that there were multiple, systematic efforts to interfere in our election. And that allegation deserves the attention of every American. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller speaking for the very first time publicly about his 2-year investigation and its conclusions regarding Russian interference in the 2016 election. He began and ended underscoring that there was a concerted attack on our election by Russian intelligence officers, the GRU, reiterating again that this was sweeping and systematic interference, saying that is where the focus should be. Notably, he did also explain where some of the questions have circulated lately, and that is around the obstruction of justice allegations and why he did not conclude, or in his words, did not exonerate the president on potential charges there. He said today it was not an option we could consider, really putting it in context to standing Department of Justice policy, saying that it was essentially what constrained them from doing so, because you cannot do so to a sitting president. Paula Reed, she's a lawyer. She has been a reporter for 2 years now on this. She's with us at the Justice Department. Paula, what stood out to you from what Mueller said today?
Margaret, this is so remarkable because this is the first time we've heard from the special counsel since he was appointed almost exactly 2 years ago. And we were told that the White House was notified that Mueller might make a statement, and a source suggested to me that this statement may be in lieu of future testimony, because efforts to arrange a way for him to answer questions before Congress have so far stalled. And you heard him in these remarks. He said that his testimony is his report, and if he was to answer any additional questions, they wouldn't go beyond the findings in his report. But what I thought was so significant is what specifically he chose to highlight in this approximately 8 minutes, specifically on obstruction of justice. While the president likes to say that the Mueller report was total exoneration for him and his campaign, the fact is Mueller did not exonerate the president. He said he could not exonerate the president and laid out a lot of evidence that suggests the president may have committed obstruction of justice. But in his remarks today, the special counsel made sure to wed the fact that he couldn't exonerate the president with the fact that there is a policy here at the Justice Department that Rod Rosenstein, who oversaw this investigation, also believed should be upheld, which is that you cannot criminally charge a president. And I think that's incredibly significant that he pointed out. He said, look, I didn't exonerate him. There's a policy. He didn't say he couldn't exonerate him based on the evidence. But the majority of Americans, according to CBS News polls, do think that Mueller should answer questions before Congress. So we'll see if this statement today means he doesn't have to testify, or if Democrats and others continue to push for him to answer questions before Congress.
Paula Reed at the Justice Department. We go now to Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett, who is standing by at the White House. Major, do we know if the president was watching this statement today?
Well, we certainly expect that he was. White House officials tell us they've certainly got notice yesterday that Bob Mueller would speak. Everyone here is curious about what he would say and how he would say it. And I think for the political atmosphere around this investigation, Margaret, the most important thing the special counsel just said was the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system when you have this question of potential presidential wrongdoing, and the Justice Department forbids an indictment of a sitting president. Translated, what does that mean? What was the special counsel saying to Congress, particularly House Democrats? There is evidence. If you believe this is sufficient to impanel an impeachment committee, that is the constitutional remedy that I'm outlining when there is a Justice Department regulation forbidding an indictment of a sitting president. Essentially, Bob Mueller said there is a process. It's called impeachment. It's in Congress's hands now. This report will speak for itself. I can't amplify it. I will not amplify it in testimony to Congress. So now, House Democrats, it's up to you. What are you going to do with the evidence laid out in this report?
Major Garrett, thank you. I want to bring in now for some analysis CBS News legal analyst Jonathan Turley, who joins us now from Washington. He is a constitutional law professor at George Washington University. Robert Mueller essentially saying, I went as far as I could go here. Why did the Justice Department allow him? Why did they ask him to make this statement today?
Well, it doesn't sound like they asked him to make the statement, according to him. But I have to tell you, he's dead wrong on that DOJ memo. There's nothing in that memo that prevents him from reaching a conclusion. Attorney General Bill Barr and the Deputy Attorney General told him to reach a conclusion, that there was not such a policy. But this is not going to go...
Sorry, can you clarify there? What we heard the special counsel say was the standard that you cannot indict a sitting president.
Right, but then he extrapolated from that. That is clear. He's right about that. But he then extrapolated from that and said, if you can't indict a president, you shouldn't find evidence of a crime. Well, that's what a special counsel does. That's what he signed up to do. Also, there's nothing that says that he can simply refuse to answer questions before Congress. Congress has a good argument there. But one thing that came out of this conference is a direct contradiction now between Mueller and Attorney General Barr. Bill Barr said that Mueller told him and Rosenstein clearly and repeatedly that the DOJ memos that you can't indict a sitting president was not the reason they were not going to reach a conclusion on obstruction. he has now basically thrown down a very strong position contradicting that. He says that that was their reason, that was a well-studied and decision of his team that they could not find evidence of crimes even if they don't indict. So that contradiction is very significant because Bill Barr's recollection of that meeting is crystal clear. So the question now becomes Rod Rosenstein. He was in that meeting, and does he recall Mueller saying as well that he was not constrained by the DOJ memos?
Very quickly, Jonathan, does the Attorney General want the special counsel to testify before Congress?
I think he does. He has said that he has no objection to Mueller testifying. And that's the reason I find this all rather strange. The Attorney General says you can testify. Congress has an oversight, a legitimate oversight interest in your testimony. And what Mueller is saying is that if you call me, I'm just going to read from the report.
All right, let's go to Capitol Hill now, where we find Nancy Cordes. As you heard Major Garrett refer to there, House Democrats have been fighting for weeks to get access to the entire Mueller report, including some classified and grand jury material. Nancy, this is not going to satisfy them.
No, but here's what Democrats who have been pushing for an impeachment inquiry to be opened will like from what they heard from Robert Mueller this morning. He said point blank that if he had confidence that the president did not commit a crime, he would have said so in his report. So those Democrats are going to take that as a sign that he thinks that there is some there that should perhaps be moved away from the Justice Department and into the congressional realm in the form of some kind of impeachment inquiry. They're also going to like the fact that he said, he didn't say point blank, Margaret, that he would not testify on Capitol Hill. He left that open. But here is what will probably discourage a lot of Democrats who have visions of the special counsel coming here to Capitol Hill, testifying in public and going into great detail about all these potential cases of obstruction of justice committed by the president. He said that if he does testify, he won't go any farther than he already has in the report.
Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. This Friday on CBS This Morning, our Jan Crawford will have an exclusive interview with Attorney General William Barr. It will be his very first network TV interview since President Trump appointed Barr to lead the Justice Department. You can expect all of this will be put to questions at that time as well. Tune in to CBS This Morning then. And our coverage will continue throughout today on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com. or through our CBS News app. There will be much more ahead on this CBS.
Here we are.
And here we are. All right, if you're just joining us back here at CBSN, I'm Vladimir Jutia, joined alongside by my colleague Anne-Marie Green, and also here with us, Caitlin Huey-Burns, CBSN political reporter. CBSN legal contributor Keir Dougal is here. He's a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York and CBS News legal contributor and former U.S. attorney for the New York County District Office. Rebecca Roife also joins us now to break down what a remarkable moment that we just witnessed from Washington, D.C., from the Department of Justice. The special counsel, Robert Mueller, delivering about an 8-minute statement on his 2-year investigation, which he says he's finally closing shop, wrapping it up. He's resigning from the Department of Justice. We've been getting notes from our Jeff Pegues and other correspondents, and Jeff points out to us what he believes to be, out of all that we heard from the special counsel, 2 things that are really important. That the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to charge the president with a crime. And if the president had not obstructed justice, he would have said so. The special counsel would have said so. So let me go first to you, Keir. Your thoughts, your takeaway from hearing from Robert Mueller.
Right, and so that point that you just made and Major Garrett also mentioned in the special report about the other process is key. It's, you know, for those of us who read the report at the time, there was this description about the policy and the thought that the Mueller team used in sort of not making a determination specifically about obstruction. It's good to hear him explain the specifics of that he felt that he was bound under the policy, that he could not charge President Trump with obstruction, that policy, however, specifically allowed the counsel's office to conduct an investigation. That's been a question that we've heard about, of course, in the press. And this sort of notion that that he would have said if there wasn't obstructive conduct, that there wasn't, and he couldn't say that, and that his anticipation was that presidential wrongdoing would be addressed by a process other than the criminal justice system, as you just mentioned, sort of leads down this path of consideration by the Congress, and it frankly throws a little bit of shade and throws some questions about the special Barr. Attorney General Barr, when he said, after I received the report, it was my baby.
I want to bring in CBS News White House correspondent Paula Reed, also an attorney, so you're a great person to talk to about this. I want to get sort of what you thought was the most important thing out of that statement. I did think it was significant that he said, like you mentioned, if he did not believe that a crime occurred, right? If he clearly did not commit a crime, I would have said so. I think that was really significant. But Paula, what jumped out to you?
It's incredibly significant, and that's where I think Democrats and others are going to continue to push on for getting Mueller in front of them to answer additional questions. He suggested that perhaps this statement will be the last time we hear from him. But of course, there is going to be an increasing demand for him to sit before lawmakers and flush out this issue of obstruction of justice. He said that his testimony is his report, but as we know, even if you haven't read the entire report, as I have, you know that actually his findings were ambiguous on the question of obstruction of justice. And he laid out approximately 10 instances that he had to examine of possible conduct that looked like the president may have been trying to interfere in his investigation. And the fact that he used part of his precious 8 minutes here to focus on obstruction and tie the fact that he couldn't exonerate the president to the fact that there is current Justice Department policy that says you can't indict a sitting president, that is very significant. It appeared that he was trying to tell the American people, look, I may have found evidence of a crime, I found evidence that was concerning, but there was nothing I could do about it because of this policy. Now, the Attorney General and others have tried to argue that Mueller has told them that no, that's not the reason that he didn't come to a conclusion. But again, that's just based on their recollection of conversations. This is what Robert Mueller is willing to stand before cameras and tell the American people. This is his version of his work product and how he came to this conclusion. It's incredibly significant. And of course, this is the first time we've heard Robert Mueller speak since he was appointed 2 years ago. Another thing, Anne-Marie and Vlad, that I thought was significant was just watching his demeanor. I've watched a lot of press conferences in that 7th floor conference room, and I was a little bit surprised by how on script he was. He barely looked up. It seemed very important that he read the words on the page, not ad-lib, not really interact with reporters. That was a little unusual. I was a little bit surprised by his demeanor. He stumbled a few times. He's obviously had a long life in public service, but his demeanor did surprise me a little bit, and the extent to which he was married to that script. That was surprising.
So, he says that this is going to be his final word, and he wants the report to speak for itself. And, but he resigned. That was sort of the first thing that came out of his mouth. So he's going to become a private citizen. I mean, is that really an option for him? If Congress wants him to sit in front and answer questions, they can subpoena him.
Look, none of these politically charged investigations are ever over, right? Nothing is ever truly final. He could potentially go before Congress and testify if he wants. Right now, there are people within the Justice Department who have been negotiating on his behalf some sort of way to testify. But we also have to acknowledge there are people in the Justice Department who have a vested interest in Mueller not necessarily going and testifying and dragging this all out again. In particular, the instances in which he has contradicted Attorney General William Barr, or that letter where he said he believed that the way the Attorney General characterized his findings created confusion. There is an interest on the part of this Justice Department not to necessarily have Mueller testify, even if publicly they say they have no problem with that. I was always told by sources close to Mueller throughout this investigation, before the report came out, that he understood testifying was part of this whole thing. He fully expected to get a request or a subpoena, and I was consistently told that he would comply. It wasn't until we had a final report and an attorney general who wanted to characterize that in a letter to Congress that suddenly the narrative changed.
All right, Paula Reed, you're there outside the Justice Department. Thank you very, very much. Let's go to CBS News Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes. She's on Capitol Hill. She's joining us now to talk about this. The other salient point out of many that the special counsel made, Nancy, he said, opinion says the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a president of wrongdoing. I took that to mean Nancy Pelosi, ball's in your court.
Right. What he was basically saying is that there is another process, and that process obviously is a congressional investigation akin to impeachment. And so that is music to the ears of those Democrats, a small but growing number of Democrats, particularly in the House, who believe that opening an impeachment inquiry is the best way to go about investigating potential cases of obstruction of justice by the President of the United States. So certainly they heard what they wanted to hear. It bolsters their case. And even for someone like Nancy Pelosi, who has said so far that she is not interested in opening an impeachment inquiry, but hasn't closed the door to it, it obviously could give her more ammunition down the line if she felt that the slew of congressional investigations that have already been taking place uncovered enough details in order to prompt an impeachment inquiry. One thing that I thought was very notable from what the special counsel said today, he did not say that he would not testify. You know, this has been going back and forth between Mueller and congressional leaders, particularly the Judiciary Committee, for weeks now, and he has made it clear that he would prefer to perhaps give an opening statement in the public, but then answer questions behind closed doors. And that is the root of the conversation and why it has taken so long for congressional leaders to nail down a date when he would testify, at least before the House Judiciary Committee, perhaps before other committees as well, because obviously Democrats would like as much of his testimony to be public as possible as they try to dig down into these 10 or dozen cases of potential obstruction of justice that Mueller laid out in his report. He didn't say in his 8 minutes that he wasn't going to testify. What he did say was that he won't go beyond the report, beyond what's in the report in his testimony. So if they're looking, for example, for him to comment on, well, if he wasn't the President of the United States, then would you have charged him with a crime? Then do you feel that there would have been enough evidence to charge him with a crime? He's not going to go there, is what he's saying. That he may be willing to testify, but he's not going to say anything, he's arguing, that is going to surprise members of Congress, because he's just not going to go beyond what he laid out very carefully with his team when he wrote that massive report. He said, we chose our words very carefully, we chose our words for a reason, and that's what I'm going to stick to. That is the historical document. So that is no doubt going to disappoint some Democrats who really were hoping that this would be quite a spectacle and would leave the president looking pretty bad at the end of the day. To be sure, it's possible that Mueller could comment on details that are in the report that would not put the president in a very favorable light, but he's not going to go further than that and freelance, if you will. He says nobody is preventing him from testifying, but clearly he would rather say less than more.
So then, Nancy, can we expect that the calls for him to testify are going to continue? Like, this statement is really not going to affect that in any way?
Absolutely. Democrats and some Republicans want to hear from him as soon as possible and as extensively as possible. And Democrats will make the case. Already, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, is likely to make a public comment himself this afternoon, do a press conference, and he'll probably say that it is still very important for Congress to hear from the special counsel, especially if the special counsel is saying that the proper constitutional realm at this point for all of these details for an investigation rests not in the hands of the Justice Department, but here on Capitol Hill.
All right, Nancy Cordes for us on the Hill. Thank you, Nancy, as always. Joining us here in the studio, Face the Nation moderator, Margaret Brennan. Good to see you.
Great to be with you.
So, Margaret, we've been talking a lot about the president and obstruction, but one thing I want to focus on with you as we kick off our discussion is what Mr. Mueller said at the end of his remarks, which he said the systematic effort by the Russians to interfere in our elections continues. And he said every American, he didn't talk about political persuasion, he said every American should be concerned about that. And he lays out what they uncovered as far as the Russians are concerned.
That's right. He was really trying to redirect attention towards what he felt we all should be concerned and Congress should be concerned about. That is to say, guys, put the politics aside here. We established that there were reasons to indict 34 different people, that we the Justice Department and my investigators concluded that they were Russian military intelligence officers, part of the GRU, who carried out what he said a concerted attack on our election. He reiterated that. Important why you hear this being thrown into question by the president, who really kind of is dismissive of this idea. And you also have calls by some in Congress to say that Russia hasn't been adequately dissuaded from doing it again, as you suggested. Lindsey Graham, others who are more hawkish on Russia, I should say, want to see more action taken. But then you get into what you all have been discussing, which is sort of the murkier political call on this, and that is, what do you do with the evidence laid out in this 400-page report in the second half, the second volume, that shows the president's frustration, his efforts to dissuade some interest in this question of what happened back in 2016. In this report, it is important to say, look, collusion is not even a crime that they looked into. It was conspiracy and coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. That was something that the special counsel said they could not develop any kind of evidence to substantiate that charge, but they did show frequent contact, regular contact. It's the obstruction of justice idea here that the special counsel seems to be saying to Congress, you work on that. But legally, I was constrained from coming to a conclusion because a sitting president cannot be indicted. And that's where the lawyers start arguing to say he should have come to some conclusion. In the view of the special counsel and the more than 17 lawyers working for him, he could not.
We have a little bit of that sound for the people who might not have seen Mueller's statement. Let's play that for you.
The special counsel's office is part of the Department of Justice, and by regulation, it was bound by that department policy. Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider. The department's written opinion explaining the policy makes several important points that further informed our handling of the obstruction investigation.
So, as I'm listening to this, Margaret, right, I'm trying to sort of think about what the spin is going to be, right? And I hear Robert Mueller say, it's unfair to accuse a person of a crime when they cannot, when there's no court proceedings, right? But then before that, he says, if clearly a crime did not occur, I would have said so. So it almost seems like with that statement that he's suggesting perhaps a crime did occur, even though he's not. It just, I feel like he's going, when the sort of, on Sunday perhaps, when you start to talk about this with your guests, many people are going to be unhappy with this statement.
They will. The fact that he's speaking out at all, I think he wants to put an exclamation point on the end of his investigation saying we're closing down the office and this is what we've done. He said again and again, referring back to this more than 400-page report, like, this is my testimony. I hope I don't have to testify again. Here's the work. And perhaps emphasizing there, read it. Because if you read those details, which many members of Congress say they've read some, maybe not all of it, you may come to your own conclusion. And that question of integrity, of the office, of behavior of the president is something that Congress has to come to its own conclusions about if they want to move forward with any kind of impeachment proceedings. And you have heard repeatedly from the Democratic House leader, Speaker Pelosi, that this has to be bipartisan and bicameral. She needs both everyone on both sides of the aisle, not everyone, but a majority of Republicans and Democrats to agree to move forward with this, and to be able to see that if they move forward with impeachment in the House, it could come to a conviction in the Senate. And they don't have that. It is a Republican-controlled Senate that so far you have not heard a single Republican senator say that what they read in this report, if they read it at all, means that they should take action. You heard Mitt Romney said, this is deeply troubling to me, some of this behavior, but still not enough to move forward.
And the other thing that Nancy Pelosi brings up is you also sort of need support from the public. I mean, impeachment is about taking the public's, and essentially sort of flipping over the election, right, and saying your votes don't count anymore because this act was so egregious. And obstruction of justice, whatever might have been obstructed, doesn't necessarily rise to the level of throwing out a national election.
Well, this is where it gets muddy, because the president would say all of this is about invalidating an election and all of this is questioning my legitimacy. He personalizes it. No, the proceedings is supposed to be about the behavior of the president, right, and what happened in these instances. Once he's there in that office, is it high crimes and misdemeanors? Is it behavior? Is it conduct? What is it that the American public is actually making the political judgment is too far or too beyond the pale in terms of behavior? And that is why it's a political judgment, not just a legal one. Not only is it worth moving forward with a congressional inquiry, but can that inquiry succeed? And it's in the second part of that, can that inquiry succeed in going ahead with an impeachment and a conviction, that you're hearing even the Democratic leader of the House say, we don't have hope of that at this point.
Every crime is not an impeachable offense, and you don't need a crime to impeach necessarily.
And that is where, when we hear from the public, oh, I just want to move on. This is not just about being inundated from news flow. This is a conversation we should be having about our democracy. What standards do we think should be upheld, and what should be moved forward with in terms of any kind of inquiry, or perhaps, not an indictment, but at least an inquiry of impeachment.
Margaret, I cannot wait to see who you have on Face the Nation this Sunday, because I expect it's going to take a look at some of these questions that we're talking about right now, and we'll get some answers from people who can actually make decisions about them. So thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, hang on one second before we bring in Major Garrett. Let's go to Senator Chuck Schumer, who we thought they were going to be making statements, but I guess they are.
Digesting the statement, but one thing is clear. Russia attempted successfully to interfere in our elections. We cannot let any foreign country interfere in our elections, whether it be Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Turkey, or anyone else. That eats at the wellspring of our democracy. And so it is incumbent on the president and our Republican leadership in the Senate to provide the money that's needed to help our election boards protect themselves so there's no further collusion in 2020. It's clear as a bell, whatever side you're on politically, that Russia interfered. It's also clear as a bell, if we sit here and do nothing, it's going to be worse in 2020. Faith in democracy will erode, and that's very bad for America. The Democrats in the Senate want to put more money and give money to the localities so they can prevent collusion. So they can prevent interference. And it should be done. This report, there's a lot of other things in it which I may comment on later, but this report is a wake-up call. We must get right on the horse, Johnny on the pony, and do everything we can to stop Russia from interfering in the 2020 election, because it's clear as a bell they did in 2016. Okay? Thank you, everybody. Okay? I don't know if you wanted to be part of that, so I said.
All right, Senator Chuck Schumer there from the podium there. He had time to set it up and everything with the little United States symbol, a seal there in Long Island, New York. Let us bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. He is joining us now from the White House lawn. Major, one of the things that we were talking about in anticipation of the special counsel's statement is what prompted it. And there was a little bit of talk, as Washington has been talking about the forthcoming book from author Michael Wolff, someone who's had some credibility issues. But it was interesting that in one of the allegations that he makes that CBS News has not been able to confirm, he says that the special counsel was preparing to indict the president for obstruction of justice on 3 counts. And that led to a stern rebuttal from the special counsel's office, Pete Carr releasing a statement saying that the documents that Mr. Wolff alleges and describes, quote, do not exist. And here, when you heard Special Counsel Robert Mueller, I thought what was interesting is he said under the Constitution, even the consideration of indicting or charging a president was not something that we could even consider. In other words, even think about, so we weren't doing it.
Right. And he also said, I'm not going to comment about other things suggested or reported about our work that I'm not commenting on here or you cannot find in the report itself. And that flat out, unambiguous denial from the special counsel's office ought to answer that fascinating, salacious, but quite probably untrue allegation in Michael Wolff's book, which would not be the first time that has happened. So let's move on from that. What happened today? Institutions in Washington sometimes feel the burden of speaking to each other in institutional voices. What you heard was the institutional voice today of the special counsel's office. What was that voice saying? One, the underlying question was important. Did Russia at its highest governmental levels decide to infiltrate the U.S. election in 2016? Answer, yes. Did it do so on behalf or at least in assistance of a known candidate? Yes. What candidate was that? Donald Trump. Was there a broader conspiracy? No, because there was insufficient evidence found by the special counsel's office. What was the other institutional point that Robert Mueller tried to make? That any attempt to obstruct that underlying and important investigation would be a very big deal. He said it would strike at the core of any government, and especially this government's ability to find the truth. And then there was this statement about obstruction. We can't indict a sitting president. There is a constitutional remedy outside the criminal justice system. And when he talked about our underlying work product, there are discussions about that. What was he, with the institutional voice of the special counsel, saying? Congress. That means, under the Constitution, an impeachment inquiry provides broader powers to obtain information of that kind, meaning grand jury information. How do we know this? Because that's what happened in Watergate. The Watergate special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, would not indict Richard Nixon. Said it was unconstitutional to do so. But once there was an impeachment inquiry opened by the House, he provided the Watergate Special Committee's underlying grand jury testimony to Congress for it to evaluate and see if there was anything sufficient there to suggest articles of impeachment. Essentially, in his institutional voice, hard to hear sometimes, hard to translate, Robert Mueller was saying, don't focus on me. I'm not going to give you any more than the report has. Focus on the report. Focus on the constitutional means by which an impeachment inquiry can broaden your ability to request and obtain our work product, and then decide for yourself if high crimes and misdemeanors have been committed. Essentially, in the institutional voice of the special counsel, Robert Mueller was telling House Democrats, this is what you have. Decide what you're going to do and stop focusing on me and my voice and whatever disagreements I had with the sitting Attorney General, William Barr, or the acting Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein.
So, Major, we just threw up the president's latest tweet on this, and he says nothing changes from the Mueller report. There was insufficient evidence, and therefore, in our country, a person is innocent. The case is closed. Thank you. But we also heard
insufficient evidence. I mean, you wouldn't want to say that if you were clearly not guilty.
Well, we also heard from Jerry Nadler. His office put out a statement. Part of what it says is that, given the special counsel Mueller was unable to pursue criminal charges against the president, it falls to Congress to respond to the crimes, lies, and other wrongdoings of President Trump, and we will do so. Major, after the Mueller report came out, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the conclusions threw a bunch of cold water on all of these investigations, congressional and otherwise, because it didn't say there was obstruction of justice. So I'm asking you with this statement, do you think that this statement bolsters the congressional Democrats that want to keep pushing for more investigations, or does it sort of fizzle out now?
That'll be entirely up to them. And I know that there's been this conversation about the political side of impeachment, and that is clearly a political decision, but it is not only a political decision. One thing I think we misunderstand about the impaneling of an impeachment inquiry or panel to begin this process is that it therefore must impeach. Not necessarily. The Constitution and the process behind it doesn't assume that if you create an impeachment inquiry panel, you are therefore required to impeach a sitting president. You have broader powers, you can obtain more information, then you can make a judgment. With that judgment and with that evidence, then you have a legal issue, a political one, but you have more of the evidence to make that political calculation. and listening to many House Democrats who are pushing for the creation of this panel, their point of view is there is more than enough evidence to at least to begin to ask these questions. We don't know all the answers, and the answers may come back and we may decide collectively, no, the president came right up against the line. He did things we object to. He did things we find politically odious, but he didn't break a law or didn't reach that level of high crimes and misdemeanors, and we're content with that. At least let the process gather as much evidence as possible so it can be evaluated through representatives elected to Congress to carry out that very constitutional obligation. That is the essence of the pro-impeachment panel argument. Those who are resisting that say, look, if you start it, the public anticipation will be that you're going to impeach the president. You'll already create a martyr complex around a president who's done a pretty effective job of creating a martyr complex around himself on this issue anyway. But there are times in life, times in politics, when you have to decide. As Lindsey Graham said last week, Republican South Carolina, ally of this White House, Democrats, whatever you're going to do, just do it. So the country knows what's going to happen next. I think institutionally, and the voice of the special counsel, Robert Mueller, said in his own way something quite similar.
Major, before we let you go, let me ask you about something that I suspected that while we were speculating what he was going to say, that he might allude to this, the special counsel. Before he wrapped up his remarks, he said, I want to thank the attorneys, the FBI agents, the analysts, the professional staff who helped us conduct this investigation in a fair and independent manner. These individuals who spent nearly 2 years with the special counsel's office were of the highest integrity. You know that the president has consistently tried to undermine the efforts of the Department of Justice by calling Robert Mueller and his team 18 angry Democrats. Well, we can fact check and say that we know that Robert Mueller is a Republican, a war hero, a man who has served this country over the last 40 plus years. Here he wants to give a shout out to those individuals who have had to suffer and listen to the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, impugn their integrity.
That's another institutional voice of the special counsel saying, on behalf of the institution I represented, not just the Justice Department, but the special mandate, the writ in legal terminology, we were given by the Justice Department here at the Office of Special Counsel. We did our work. It can be evaluated in the public realm. It doesn't have to beat its chest to say we did it well. Judge it for yourself. Judge our work by the indictments made, by the guilty pleas achieved, and by the convictions obtained. And in his own institutional voice, Robert Mueller was essentially telling President Trump, you are downplaying this recklessly, that is to say Russian interference. You have assailed my office. You have assailed me personally. You have assailed the people who've worked here. We don't deserve that. Our work product speaks for itself. And for the public at large, separate from the whole question of whether a crime was committed, are you comfortable with the politicization at this White House of what this investigation was meant to pursue, what it found, and what it's told the country? In Robert Mueller's words, he believes that far outweighs the voluminous and oftentimes loud criticism from this White House.
Major Garrett, always good hearing your assessment of everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Major.
You got it.
So we have Kara Dougal, Rebecca Roife, and Caitlin Huey-Bird standing by through this whole thing for us. And so I want to go to you, Rebecca. I'll start with the general question and sort of like what your biggest takeaway was from the statement. Robert Mueller says that he will not be testifying to anything beyond what's in that report. But that report left people with a lot of questions, and I don't know if this statement clarified.
Yeah, I mean, and beyond that, a lot of people haven't read the report. So I think his testimony will be incredibly important, whether or not he goes outside the four corners of the report. But a couple of things stuck out to me. First of all, I think that this 8 minutes shows just how powerful and important a figure Mueller is, because he always manages to do two things at once. One is to preserve the integrity of the Department of Justice, and the other is to get the facts out in a clear and fair way that cuts through all of the partisan noise. So he did both of those things. He did the first one by not criticizing Bill Barr. He did not say any one thing directly negative about him. In fact, he complimented him for the one thing that Bill Barr did extremely well, which was get all that information to Congress, get that report out there.
Right, and in fact, he comments on the fact that he had wanted to send out or release sort of a shortened version of the report, and Bill Barr said, no, we're going to release as much as we can.
Right, but At the same time, this press conference in 8 minutes was such a clear rebuttal to Bill Barr's press conference and to Bill Barr's memo. He did that in 3 ways. First, the last thing he said in this press conference was there were multiple systematic attempts to attack our election, and every American should care. So that is a direct response to Bill Barr. The second thing he said is, this is how we started this investigation. It was started with integrity, and it was done according to DOJ policy. That also direct response to Bill Barr. The third thing he did is the thing that many people have been talking about, which is the obstruction of justice charge. The reason why I did not come to a conclusion on that obstruction of justice charge is because we are not the right body. And that is a direct response to Bill Barr. Why did you say this didn't amount to obstruction of justice? We're not the right people to decide that.
Keir, and Rebecca too, the president's tweet, nothing changes from the Mueller report. There was insufficient evidence, and therefore, in our country, a person is innocent. The case is closed. There are hundreds of people who contributed to the civil rights movement who were found guilty with insufficient evidence, and in many cases were lynched. Or there are people in prisons right now who there was insufficient evidence and were found guilty. I don't understand this tweet, and I don't understand how it helps him.
But to what you had mentioned, and I sort of didn't stop, and I should have stopped when you talked about, I mean, the phrasing of insufficient evidence
means that there's a little bit,
but yes, it's not saying there's no evidence. This was, like he's been repeating, this has been sort of a witch hunt based on nothing. It's saying that there was something,
you got a little bit, but not enough.
So you couldn't get me.
You can't get me. I'm too smooth. How do you read that as a prosecutor, as an attorney, as somebody? Am I reading it wrong? Or you can correct me on national television, but it strikes me that when you say there's insufficient evidence, psych.
No, I think you have it absolutely right, and I think Mr. Trump doesn't understand what's sort of the larger legal context here. So the notion of the presumption of innocence is it's an instruction that's given at a trial where somebody's already been charged. President Trump hasn't been charged. The purpose of that instruction goes to the core of our due process in the criminal justice system, our rights. And effectively what it does is it requires the prosecutor to carry the entire burden of guilt. And so in this circumstance where President Trump has not been charged and there's no prosecutor that has a burden to demonstrate his guilt, it really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any context here. And so, I would suspect that that statement, there was insufficient evidence, thus acknowledging implicitly that there is all that evidence that was in the Mueller report is going to perhaps come back to haunt Mr. Trump.
So I just want to say that I think that that Mueller said something subtly different in this press conference than he did in the report about obstruction of justice. I think the president's picking up on that accurately because it's a little bit more damning the way that he gave the information. He basically said, look, if we found he didn't commit a crime, we would have said so. If we found that he did commit a crime, we wouldn't have said anything. And the third part there is the part for you to fill in. He said nothing. Now, of course, it's not a full logical argument, but the emphasis is different. And I think that the president heard that, and I think that this tweet sounds a little bit defensive.
Right. So, Caitlin, now where do we go from here? Right? Because we can talk all this legal stuff, but we're talking about politics too.
Right.
Where do the Democrats go from here?
Now this does become a political issue. This was the equivalent of Robert Mueller dropping the mic, saying, I'm not testifying about this. My report is my testimony, which I think we might start to see on T-shirts at some point soon. He is to Rebecca and Keir's point, very concerned about the integrity of this investigation and wanted to have the last word on this. Now, over to Congress. And we are hearing from members of Congress a few different things. You mentioned Nadler, who wouldn't quite go there yet, but there is some news coming from some of the 2020 candidates. Some of them have, like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, have called for impeachment proceedings. Others have been really cautious, not willing to go there yet. We're seeing from Cory Booker, though, senator from New Jersey, that Congress has the legal and moral obligation to begin impeachment proceedings immediately. So that is at least a shift from Cory Booker, and we'll see if other candidates follow suit, those who are in Congress specifically. We're also waiting to hear the reaction from Republicans. We talked a lot about Justin Amash, the congressman from Michigan, who has been somewhat of an anomaly. He has read the report, and you see that tweet up there. He was greeted with a warm welcome by his constituents in his district last night. But again, he has not been so far representative of the Republican Party, which has largely been united around Trump, defiant actually in the face of this report. And I don't think this press conference, this statement, I should say, really changes that dynamic. But I am wondering whether Amash is able to convince his colleagues otherwise.
Is it critical then that Nancy Pelosi, I'm just trying to understand how she can gather critical mass in the Congress. You've got Justin Amash, he's one. He says in that town hall yesterday that he has spoken to his colleagues, Republicans, who have called him and said that they agree with the position that he is taking publicly, but that they will not take that position because of the fear of blowback from their constituent.
Right.
Something that, I don't remember who said it because we've been here for a couple of hours now, but somebody said, maybe it was Ed O'Keefe, who said, next week, or throughout the course of this recess, they're going to be hearing from people after this. And maybe next week we come back and we get another one, or maybe 2 or 3. Do you think that will happen?
They are back doing town halls. I am interested to see whether the Democrats who were elected in 2018 from Trump districts, from Republican districts, whether they are starting to hear anything from their constituents that might change their minds. Because remember, Democrats are not united around the idea of impeachment, and that's why you've seen some allies of Nancy Pelosi talk about beginning proceedings, not actually going there just yet, but wanting to open up impeachment proceedings. And that's a little bit different and a way for them to kind of have a lot of things politically. She has been very cautious, though, about going there. She has said in the past that impeachment divides the country. She has said that Trump is trying to goad Democrats into impeachment because he knows, is well aware, and Trump allies and sources I've talked to are well aware of the political fallout that we've seen in recent history from the Clinton administration, what that could mean for the incumbent president heading into this election. But it is interesting to see a little bit of a shift, and we'll see if more 2020 candidates come out and say what Cory Booker has been saying, because on the campaign trail, I can say that nobody's really been talking about the Mueller report, at least from voter perspectives. They've been talking about things like healthcare, climate change, issues around guns and their own personal economy, wages. And they haven't really been asking about the Mueller report. And we see this actually reflected in CBS polling that the country is pretty divided or split on what to actually make of this report. Be interested to see if Mueller cleared any of that up today, or if Americans are still left wondering what to actually make of this 400 some odd pages.
Let me ask, can I just react to what Caitlin just said, because I thought it was really important. So Mueller says, the criminal justice system is not the channel to address presidential wrongdoing, where the policy says that you can't charge the president. There's another process. And a lot of the discussion focuses immediately on impeachment. But and Caitlin was just getting to it, that's not the only process that Congress has available to it. Andrew Jackson was infamously censured by the Congress, and he was furious about it. And President Polk, and I'm going to pull out my presidential geek a little bit now.
Glad to be with you.
I'm right here.
President Polk was also censured. So this is another avenue that the Congress can use to express its condemnation of presidential wrongdoing without perhaps invoking all the political fraughtness around an impeachment inquiry. And just the only other little thing I want to mention and just bring back into the discussion are the decisions that we got from the 2 courts last week, where they upheld congressional subpoenas, investigative subpoenas, on a theory that there was a proper legislative purpose, and that those investigations could continue, notwithstanding that we have not yet formally launched an impeachment proceeding. So there are sort of intermediate steps that the Congress can consider before jumping into that, deep, cold pool of an impeachment, potentially cold, of an impeachment inquiry.
We're just putting up the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which has accelerated its losses since the moment that Mr. Mueller wrapped up his statement. So we'll keep an eye out on that. It is interesting that we have that Dow up there because when you look at the precedents for impeachment, possible impeachment of Richard Nixon, the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the two I think that are important to point out, and I'm sure Nancy Pelosi is thinking about this, is the economy was doing so well when Bill Clinton was president. A lot of people were very happy with the moves that he was making with regards to the budget. He was working with a Republican Congress in balancing the budget and ultimately adding to the surplus, whereas Richard Nixon came in, the inquiry into Watergate started when the markets and the economy started to do really, really poorly. And so when people look at the end of before Nixon resigned, his poll numbers were down as opposed to Clinton's were up. You can draw your own conclusions. It's the economy stupid. I think it was the Clinton people who came up with that statement. So there's a lot of things that the House Speaker has to consider as they think about this. There's two things that I wanted to point out. One, Robert Mueller did make a point to thank the Attorney General. He said, we appreciate the Attorney General making the report public, and I do not question the Attorney General's good faith in that decision. But some people are pointing that out on social media. He doesn't say that I don't question his good faith in that summary report that he released, which Justin Amash himself, having read the Mueller report, says the Attorney General misinterpreted. Rebecca.
Right. I mean, so that's what I was saying earlier. It seems to me that this is an incredibly professional way of rebutting what Bill Barr did, of providing a counter statement. And if we just pause for a moment and think, if this were the press conference that we heard right when the Mueller report came out, rather than the 4-page memo and Barr's press conference, would we be facing a different political climate because of the way that the information was provided to the American people? I think that Mueller's statement here is an important one. Bill Barr, as much as you may disagree with many of the things that he has done, did one thing that was incredibly important, and that was get this report to Congress and to the American people with very few redactions. And so I think that he is right to point to that as being important. And then the criticism is completely implicit. And I agree with you. It is in this statement. It's in those 8 minutes. But it's done in such a way as we don't think what's going on. There's infighting within this institution. We think this is somebody who is a consummate professional, who's out there making sure that he cuts through the partisan noise rather than in some way embodying it. And it's actually quite remarkable that he's maintained that ability to do that throughout this incredibly difficult time in which he's been investigating, and his investigation has been under attack.
So I know that, Rebecca, I think you have to go, but Kara and Caitlin, you guys are standing by. We want to let everyone know that it is noon.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green, along with Vladimir Duthier. We are monitoring some breaking news out of Washington.
So the breaking news, if you've been following us, if you have not, and we're resetting here, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has weighed in for the very first time on his Russia investigation. In a news conference just about an hour ago, Mr. Mueller made clear that while his report did not exonerate President Trump of obstruction, he felt constitutionally barred from charging the president with a crime. That's in accordance with Department of Justice guideline, which asserts a sitting president cannot be indicted. Listen.
And as set forth in the report, after that investigation, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. The introduction to the Volume 2 of our report explains that decision. It explains that under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. That is unconstitutional. Even if the charge is kept under seal and hidden from public view, that too is prohibited. The Special Counsel's office is part of the Department of Justice, and by regulation, it was bound by that department policy. Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider.
The special counsel's statement comes amid demands that he testify on Capitol Hill about his findings. And he also expressed support for Attorney General William Barr. He's in Alaska today. He'll be speaking to CBS News, though, for an interview set to air tomorrow and Friday. So now there's a whole other list of other questions that we'll be asking.
That's right, for sure. And in response to the special counsel's statement, President Trump tweeted this, quote, "Nothing changes from the Mueller report. There was insufficient evidence, and therefore, in our country, A person is innocent. The case is closed. Thank you. Here's a live look at the big board where the Dow is continuing to extend its losses. So let's continue to dig into this with our CBS News political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, who is in Washington. Ed, so it seems that with that statement that the special counsel made, if we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. That's what we're hearing from members of Congress as they react to the statement. They're focusing on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty evident he was trying to do it in a gentlemanly way, that we couldn't conclude that ourselves. And oh, by the way, there is another process here that can take up this issue since the Justice Department cannot. That was a sort of implied suggestion or, telling to Congress, take up the issue. You have the power to do it. And you should. And so, if you were summarizing what he said today, it's Congress, do your job, but don't necessarily call me, because if you want me to testify, I'm basically going to repeat chapter and verse what's in my 448-page report, and don't think it's proper for me to weigh in on anything else. Members of Congress will have a different impression on that, or a different opinion on that. We expect to hear later today, probably from members of the House Judiciary Committee especially, who've been negotiating with Mueller and the Justice Department to possibly have him testify either publicly or privately. I don't necessarily see them dropping that demand given this statement today, because I think there would be a lot of questions about what he said and what he didn't say, or the way he said it today and the ways he didn't say it, and they might want to draw him out on that a little bit. So we'll have to wait and see. But clearly they're signaling, we didn't make definitive conclusions on obstruction of justice. We can't. There's another way to do that. Talk to that branch of government about it, and don't necessarily call me.
Caitlin, we've been talking a bit about the reaction of the Democrats, right? Whether this will kind of add more fuel to the fire, increase the calls for some sort of, whether it's impeachment or censure or something else. But it occurred to me that the Republicans are in a bit of a pickle, too. So they're going to be hearing from their constituents. Everyone's back home. It's recess. And they are faced with this dilemma of not having a lot to show for their periods, so at this point in Congress. Yeah, you can point to the Supreme Court justices, but other than that, we haven't had any major legislation passed, and a president that's saying, in fact, we're not going to do any legislating until you stop investigating me. Right. So then what do they say to their constituents about, why you should continue to back the party?
Well, you also have to think about the makeup of Congress now when it comes to the Republican Party. Many of the moderate members of the Republican Party were wiped out in the 2018 election, largely due to this reaction that we saw among the electorate to this presidency. Even in a good economy, even with perceived Republican accomplishments on things like tax reform and other items, still voted against, sent that message to the president. Right. So right now in Congress, most of the Republicans there, with a few exceptions, are largely allies of the president, and that's reflected in their districts. He's still wildly popular among Republicans, and that's what the president is really counting on in his reelection, that Republicans have not turned on him. We talked earlier about Justin Amash, who is something of an anomaly in Congress right now. Again, as I mentioned, we'll see whether others actually follow suit now that we've heard from Mueller. But given what we've seen, we haven't seen Republicans turn on the president. And that's why Barr's outline was so important in the beginning, because it did characterize the results of this investigation that the president was able to seize on and make that the message that people could interpret. Because remember, this investigation has gone on for 2 years, which is not that long compared to other special counsel investigations. But in the mind of the public, there have been mixed reviews, and the results have been pretty incremental. And so that's what the president has tried to capitalize on politically. But Democrats are arguing that they have a responsibility in Congress to conduct oversight of the president. And I think they are particularly taking note from Mueller today, who said this is now in your court.
So does that mean, Ed, though, that, Republican members of Congress are going to have to go back to their constituents and say, well, one of the campaign issues that we're having is that, the presidential harassment is a campaign issue because they won't have other things to show for it. And the president doesn't seem to want to give up on this idea of that Democrats keep sort of picking on him.
Well, as Caitlin said, there's very little political price to pay right now for being on the president's side if you're a member of Congress from a Republican-leaning district or Republican-leaning state. Unless or until we start to see polling that shows a majority of Republicans, especially in these red districts, support what Mueller said, that Congress should pursue this and that everyone should cooperate, they're going to hold pretty firm to that. There's, at this point, I think 3 House Republican districts left that had voted for Hillary Clinton. They're in Philadelphia, upstate New York, and I'm forgetting where the other one is. But Texas, Will Hurd. And so, you know, outside of those 3, there isn't necessarily somebody who feels a political need to straddle this and have it both ways. Maybe we'll see some other Republicans break on principle or for some other reason, or just believe that, you know, as an Article 1 fan, that Congress should actually do this work of investigating and possibly impeaching and removing the president. But for most Republicans, this is an issue. It's going to be trickier for Democrats. Growing calls among Democrats to do this. If you're one of those Democrats who got elected last fall in a swing district that's huge Republican before, you have to somehow ride the middle on this potentially, unless over this week and over the next few months you hear from constituents who say, no, go ahead, let this run its course and we'll see how you vote on it.
Keir, let me ask you a question about the way that we, and I mean reporters and the world, waited for Robert Mueller to make this statement. I was struck by, and I'm still digesting it, that what we heard in his statement is not very different what we saw and read in the report. In other words, if people had taken the time to read the report, Robert Mueller did not offer anything differently today than he offered in his report. In his report, he says that they were not able to draw a conclusion on obstruction of justice for the same reasons that he listed today, and he did not exonerate the President of the United States in that 448-page summary. So it's interesting to me that all of a sudden people are like, well, here's what he said, and you're going to see that soundbite being replayed over and over and over again because it's video, I get it. But the fact that he said something that is already in the report strikes me as, I mean, do you not see, am I right about that, that the stuff that he said today is what is the public testimony that he says is the report?
It is, and of course it goes to the power of the media to be able to put those words, to put them, Major Garrett described it as the institutional voice, but now, you know, we've had Robert Mueller, who has sort of been Sphinx-like, you know, so quiet over 2 years that he chose to wait 2 years and to, you know, say the things that he chose to say in this 8 minutes makes those things particularly important. And so, I mean, I'd like to just step back for a second. The obstruction question is, it is important, but the larger and much more important question here is where he started, which is the Russian interference, that they found a systematic effort by the Russians to interfere with our country's elections and to do it in a way that favored one particular candidate and was intended to harm another, to favor President Trump and to hurt the Clinton candidacy. That is, I think, is the #1 top takeaway. And I think that is the question that, you know, may not be the questions that the Congress has to straddle over. I mean, that's a question that is, I think it should be important to every American. And so the fact that he waited 2 years and then gave an extremely short press conference where he took no questions and then highlighted, you know, the handful of things that he wanted us all to focus on as the key takeaways, and by literally telling us what the key takeaways are.
It's sort of like, if I could offer some humor here, it's like, hey, I didn't read the book, but I just saw the movie. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
So Russian interference, it actually happened. You know, we've got multiple indictments. You know, there was a multifaceted and concerted effort by the Russians to interfere with our elections. That's the key takeaway. And, you know, so then getting to the point that we've also been talking about, the obstruction point, we are certainly left with a question, or at least the Congress is, a question of what to make of this sort of large, it's really a mountain of evidence. And because the special counsel was unable, under the policy, to charge the president, if he had been able to charge the president, and if he had done so, we would know some things. We would know that Mueller had come to the conclusion that he was likely to be able to obtain and sustain a conviction of the president. That is the other DOJ policy, which we're not talking about. In order to do that, the prosecutor knows at trial they must have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high threshold of evidence. Effectively, what it means is you're asking a unanimous jury of 12 to review the evidence, vote to convict, and go home and sleep well at night. That's the sort of take away the legalese. That's the real impact of what a prosecutor has to do to obtain a conviction. Because Mr. Mueller didn't do that, we don't know, it's hard for us to know whether or not when he says, I can't exonerate the president, he still believes that he would have met that threshold or not. You can, in fact, as a legal technical matter, you can charge someone based purely on probable cause, which is a much lower threshold. Again, the DOJ policy is the prosecutors shouldn't go forward unless they believe they can obtain and sustain a conviction based on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But we don't clearly know Mueller's view of where the evidence lands.
So we shouldn't read too much into, if he did not commit a crime, I would have said so.
It is hard to know as a technical matter exactly what that means. And even if you can argue, even if you're applying the DOJ policy that would implicate the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you still have this, different prosecutors may disagree over whether or not evidence is likely to reach probable. It might be very high and right on the cusp, and some prosecutors might say that's close but not quite enough. Other prosecutors might say, yes, I think it is likely that I could obtain and sustain a conviction. So, I know there's been a letter out there with hundreds and hundreds of former prosecutors saying that they would charge, but it is hard for us to know exactly where Mueller has landed on this question, and if he sticks to his commitment today that the report is his testimony and nothing more, we're not necessarily going to get a satisfactory answer to that question. Now, the next part of this is what Caitlin was talking about, or what we were talking about earlier, was the other process, the congressional process, an impeachment or a censure process. There are rules, but they don't have a fixed standard of evidence to determine whether or not the president has committed wrongdoing. It's rule bound, but it's more of a political inquiry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Caitlin, what I wanted to ask you is we sort of launch into the 2020 election campaign. You know, the president's probably going to be doing another campaign style event. Has this put it to bed in any way, this statement, or is this going to continue to be part of the president's speeches? They just can't get over the last election, and so they keep coming after me.
I would expect that to continue. We've already seen.
Will that be something that brings Republican voters together?
We have seen the president use what we call kind of grievance politics, and that worked for him in 2016. And we have seen him on the campaign trail already talking about Democrats and trying to paint them as obstructionists, saying, look, they are only trying to investigate. I'm trying to do this. The president thinks that works in his favor, and some Republicans do agree with that. And they have been largely united around him, particularly since he has been able to get things done that they really like. Regulation cutting on a lot of different levels, and of course, judges, both federal judges and Supreme Court justices. That has been kind of the binding force between Republicans and Donald Trump. And so I expect him to kind of continue that. What I am watching for is how the rhetoric on the Democratic side of these candidates changes. We saw Cory Booker, who today came out and said we should start impeachment proceedings. He had been reluctant to really go there until now. I'm kind of waiting to see what the other candidates say. What's also interesting, what I'm keeping an eye on too, is that Mueller did say that access to the underlying evidence, there were some negotiations being made, I assume by the Justice Department, to be also released. That's something that Democrats in Congress have been asking for, and some candidates on the campaign trail have been talking about. But I'm wondering, because this wasn't heavily redacted, Is there anything else that we're wondering about that report that could be in that underlying
Hang on before you answer that, Keir, because I just want to bring Ed O'Keefe before he has to go. He's still standing by in Washington. Ed, we're starting to hear now from members of Congress. We've heard from Cory Booker, either through tweets or through statements, Jerry Nadler, including this one, this tweet from Republican Justin Amash of Michigan. We were talking about him earlier. He had that town hall yesterday with his constituents where he got a standing ovation for his position that he believes that the Congress should begin impeachment proceedings, or at least an inquiry into the President of the United States. He threw up this tweet, the ball is in our court, Congress.
Right. So that's his impression. Other Republicans, however, saying this is over, let's move on. They're all coming into the inbox at once. So why don't I just read to you the Trump campaign statement in part that just arrived. So Special Counsel Robert Mueller's remarks today confirmed what we already knew. There was no collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign, and there was no case for obstruction. President Trump has been fully and completely exonerated. Mueller says his investigation is over. The case is now closed. Notably, the Trump campaign adds this: now it's time to turn to the origins of the Russia hoax and get to the bottom of why the Trump campaign was spied on by the Obama-era DOJ and FBI. Anyone who is for transparency, constitutional civil liberties, and the rule of law should want to know why human sources, wiretapping, and unmasking were used to infiltrate a presidential campaign. That speaks to what Attorney General Barr has now launched, which is to look into the people who first looked into Russian interference and potential collusion with the Trump campaign. That is underway at the Justice Department now, and in essence fulfills the president's wishes that part of this whole affair get also investigated as well. You mentioned Cory Booker. He today going farther than he has gone before in calling for impeachment, at least according to our friends in the political unit who track this stuff more closely. They're saying that the tweet that he sent out a little while ago, signaling now that he supports impeachment, is further than he has gone. Others who are running for president, not surprisingly, making similar comments that Congress should do its work, investigate this, and go to impeachment if needed, or that they should be doing it already. That's no surprise, and we'll continue to see reaction throughout the day. Jerry Nadler, you mentioned as well, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, in a statement a little while ago saying that because Mueller said now and has laid out why exactly he didn't bring up obstruction charges, it falls, quoting Nadler, to Congress to respond to the crimes, lies, and other wrongdoing of President Trump, and we will do so. No one, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. So the committee, primarily charged with considering potential impeachment charges, led by that man, Jerry Nadler, is now, in essence, going full bore into that, he says. So, this could be a train that Democrats who are reluctant or worried about doing this cannot stop at this point. And they'll simply cite what Mueller said today. Look, he told us to do this. He said he can't conclude it. We're the process that can. Therefore, we should start it.
To that point, Ed, Kamala Harris, who is running for president of the United States, just pinned this tweet to her Twitter account. What Robert Mueller basically did was return an impeachment referral. Now it is up to Congress to hold this president accountable. We need to start impeachment proceedings. It is our constitutional obligation. Maxine Waters has also tweeted. This one is Maxine Waters, being a very liberal member of the House. This one's going to be a little bit more of a zing. She writes this: Mueller made clear Trump is not exonerated and that AG Barr is a liar. Mueller did his job. Now it's time for Congress to do its job. No more hiding behind the special counsel. Enough is enough. It's time to #impeach Trump. We can't wait for 2020. The time is now.
And both of those really quite effectively sum up what many partisan liberal Democrats, big critics of the president, feel, which is, okay, he's spoken, he's closed up shop, now get to work. We'll see what happens over the course of the next few weeks.
The chair of the Finance Committee in the House and is looking into all things related to the president's bank statements and loans that he's received already in his past business life. And so she's a significant figure to be weighing in, even if she's repeating a lot of the things she has already said.
Right. Keir, the president's statement, the campaign statement on Robert Mueller's remarks that we just received that Ed referenced, he says, now it's time to turn to the origins of the Russia hoax. And it sort of is mind-boggling. He says, let's turn to the origins of the Russia hoax. And then you've got Robert Mueller that says the central allegation of our indictments that there were multiple systematic efforts to interfere in our election, and that allegation deserves the attention of every American. Robert Mueller is saying they did this once, they're going to do it again. The President of the United States in a statement says, let's turn to the origins of the Russia hoax.
Well,
the origins is what he just laid out.
I would suggest that when they're talking about the origins, what they're talking about is the suggestion that there was collusion, cooperation, whatever, between the Trump campaign and the Russians. I think no one doubts, even though the president has said things, that there has been Russian meddling in the campaign and in our election. But the idea that they were coordinating is what the Trump campaign is rejecting, I think.
Right, and so we're hearing potentially very contradictory things depending on what Russia hoax refers to. And given the importance of these issues, I think it would, I think it's incumbent upon the administration to clarify what they mean
by Russia hoax.
By Russia hoax.
Good point. Yeah.
And so, but let's step back. Just step back for a minute. Robert Mueller's team had access to the very best investigative tools that we have as a country. He, in the GRU, in the Russian military intelligence indictment, put particular Russian officers at particular computers typing particular things at particular moments in time, which is remarkable, I think, to someone who was outside of law enforcement and perhaps outside of counterintelligence. We know there were hundreds of subpoenas, hundreds of witnesses, hundreds of search warrants. This is an extraordinarily thorough investigation by someone who is across the partisan spectrum respected deeply for his professionalism. We've all been talking about it. His top takeaway after being silent for 2 years in his 8 minutes was to start by saying there was a very serious effort to interfere with the sovereignty of our country and our national elective process. So that's one, if that's what the Russia hoax comment from the administration statement refers to, fair-minded people are going to simply have to weigh the foundation for those two statements and the political motivations of the two speakers. If it's the distinction that you just made, Anne-Marie, about the origins of the investigation, again, I think we need to step back and understand how the FBI got into this. James Comey wrote an editorial in an opinion in the Washington Post yesterday, which reminds us all of this process, right? So, first of all, there was an ongoing investigation of the Clinton campaign relating to emails, and the FBI was transparent about that. And arguably, the FBI's transparency there hurt the Clinton campaign. On the Trump side, when the investigation commenced, the FBI was completely silent. And we didn't learn about this until after the election. So fair-minded people need to ask, was the FBI in the campaign period, were they out there trying to sabotage or hurt the Trump campaign? That's the first question that I think is right. And then if you get into the specifics about how the FBI opened its investigation, remember, George Papadopoulos is approached. He's told that the Russians have information in the form of emails that they could share that would hurt the Clinton campaign. Papadopoulos does not go to the FBI. The FBI learns about this months later when an allied nation, it's Australia, their intelligence services reported to us that Papadopoulos had disclosed this in a bar. Meanwhile, in the interim, the DNC reports that it had been hacked and attributed the hack to the Russians. So when you have that information, if you're sitting at the FBI with that information at that moment in July, and you don't ask yourself, what if you didn't act? That, in my opinion, as a former prosecutor, that would be a dereliction of duty, not to follow up on that. So the question then becomes, is it true? Do the Russians really have this information? Are they using it? And because Papadopoulos reports that he has the information but doesn't disclose it to law enforcement, I think that creates a fair question about, are members of the Trump administration potentially involved and conspiring with the Russians? Now, Mueller did that investigation and found that that wasn't the case. Right. But it's important to understand that back in July of 2016, in my opinion, as a former prosecutor, you would have been, asleep at the wheel. You would have been not performing the duty that you signed up to perform had you not followed up on that investigation.
Right. That doesn't make it a hoax because there was an investigation that found that there was nothing there. There was a reason to investigate. It started as an FBI investigation, and I think you rightly point out, if the FBI was sort of said, oh, well, then we would wonder what are you doing, right?
Right. If they had done nothing,
yeah,
we would, and we found out about it now, I think people would be outraged and would be shocked. And flip the script and say, instead of, flip the script. Let's say Trump's campaign was being subject to an email investigation like Hillary Clinton's was, and one of Hillary Clinton's aides had been offered, Russian stolen emails, and just flip that script, and we learned about it now, and President Trump was in office now, we'd be outraged that the FBI had not investigated the Clinton campaign if the roles had been reversed.
Yeah.
Caitlin, before we wrap this up real quickly, because you've spent quite a bit of time with us going over this, it's interesting now what Ed said, which I think is going to be the narrative that Congress is going to be looking at. You're seeing a lot of members of Congress saying, look, Robert Mueller has given us this mandate. We have to begin this impeachment inquiry, which is different than an impeachment proceeding, but they actually, if they don't decide to do that, there are some who are saying it could be a constitutional or political mistake, a moral mistake even.
Yeah, and I think that's what changes the dynamic, if anything else. We know that Republicans are still allied with the president. We even heard from the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee saying, look, we're not relitigating this. This is over. I think that's reflective of what we're going to see from Republicans. We are seeing, at least so far at this beginning stage, this reaction from Democrats of, well, maybe this is just something that we have to do. So I'm watching to see whether those reluctant Democrats who have been really keeping calls for impeachment at bay, trying to wait to see how this investigation went, whether this is really changing minds. We've seen that reflected in Cory Booker's statement today. We'll wait and see how Democrats respond to this as well.
Keir Dougal, Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you both so very much. To Ed O'Keefe, who has been with us, who's not now with us, but he has been along for the ride. We thank Ed, Rebecca Royfee, Nancy Cordes, Paula Reed, and Margaret Brennan, who was also here. We did have a very, very good crew because we don't know as much as they know. We just ask a lot of questions and we opine based on what we're seeing from reporting. But it is so wonderful to have all of you here with us to help make sense of this. Oh, that's very kind. We try. We try to come.
Believe it or not, there's other news going on.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people who have been affected by things that have been happening across this country who were not fixated on their television watching Robert Mueller deliver his remarks.
The midsection of the country has been hit every day, basically, for the past few days with some very, very dangerous, in fact, deadly weather, tornadoes touching down in some areas, a dangerous flooding at risk of continuing throughout the rest of the week. And so all of that stuff we're going to be covering as well. We're going to take a quick break for now, though. You are watching CBSN.
And severe storms continue to pose a threat across the Midwest. This has been going on for nearly 2 weeks. At least 8 tornadoes a day have been detected for 12 days in a row. That is the longest such streak in nearly 40 years.
Just look at the size of that storm.
Look at that storm.
Yeah.
At least 15 people have been killed, and the same system has created historic flooding.
Wow. Jerika Duncan is in Linwood, Kansas, where a massive tornado touched down just yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
A nearly mile-wide tornado ripped through Kansas Tuesday, destroying at least a dozen homes just outside Linwood. Look at that! Oh my God! Damaging winds flipped cars and pulled down trees and power lines.
Here's our living room.
Dina Duffin and several of her neighbors lost their homes.
It's all gone. Hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to salvage some stuff. We didn't lose everything. We didn't lose our lives.
To the west, Lawrence was one of the hardest hit areas.
We took cover in the corner of the basement by the concrete wall, and we heard the upstairs just blow up and water started rushing in from up above.
At least 12 people were brought to Lawrence Memorial Hospital for tornado-related injuries. Crews at Kansas City International Airport cleaned up thousands of pieces of debris into the night, warning one piece in an engine can be catastrophic.
All of a sudden, it's like rapid-fire machine gun hitting the side of the house.
Tornadoes were reported from Colorado to New Jersey, pummeling parts of Pennsylvania.
Things that were in the bedroom are in the dining room, doors off their hinges. Yeah, it just did a number.
All right, Jerika, so walk us through the damage where you are. It looks absolutely devastating.
Well, right now we're standing on this greenhouse space, and it's 10 acres large, so that's pretty big. And just walking you through, you can see some of the plants and things that are scattered.